Somewhere in a European forest 40,000 years ago, a small group of people came around a rock ledge and met something that shouldn't have looked human, but did. A heavy brow ridge pressing down over the eyes. A jaw built wider and thicker than anything on any face they knew. A chest and a set of shoulders shaped for absorbing impact, not for looking graceful. Not a monster, not a myth. A Neanderthal. And when that encounter ended, whichever way it ended, the people who walked away from it went home and told a story about it. Stay with that for a moment, because almost every culture that has ever existed tells some version of the same story. A near-human creature, bigger, stronger, uglier by human standards, living at the edge of the world, in caves, in forests, in the dark places just past where people feel safe. The Greeks called them Cyclopes. The Norse called them jötnar. Slavic folklore has the leshy, the wild man of the woods. Across Central Asia and the Himalayas, people describe the almas, a hair-covered near man of the mountains. Western Europe eventually folded all of it into a single word: ogre. Different names, different continents, different centuries of storytelling with no contact between them, and yet the shape of the creature barely changes. Why would that happen? That's usually where people stop and call it coincidence, or imagination, or the same fears surfacing in different places by accident. But there's a stranger explanation sitting underneath it, one that isn't about imagination at all. It's about memory. Here's the part most people never learned in school. For thousands of years, two different species of human shared this planet at the same time. Homo sapiens, that's you, and Homo neanderthalensis, a close relative who had already been living across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before your ancestors ever arrived. You were not alone here, and you were not the only thing walking around that looked human. We know roughly how long that overlap lasted, and the number came from very careful work. Professor Thomas Higham at Oxford Radiocarbon dated around 200 samples of bone, charcoal, and shell from 40 key European archaeological sites, using a purification technique called ultrafiltration to strip out modern contamination that had thrown off earlier dates. His conclusion was that modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe for somewhere between 2,600 and 5,400 years. Do you understand what that means? That is not a brief encounter. That is dozens of generations of two kinds of human sharing the same valleys, the same rivers, the same hunting grounds. And they did not simply die out and vanish. In 2010, a team led by the geneticist Svante Pääbo published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, work so foundational he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for it. What that genome revealed changed the whole question. People with ancestry outside of Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. And in 2024, by reading the oldest modern human genomes ever sequenced, researchers pinned down when that mixing happened, around 47,000 years ago, over a sustained stretch of roughly 7,000 years. 7,000 years is not a rare accident at the edge of two worlds. That's a shared history, so the creature at the edge of the firelight isn't only in the story, it's in you. Which brings us back to that forest. Before you decide the ogre is pure invention, ask the more useful question. What would it actually have looked like the first time a Homo sapiens met a Neanderthal in poor light? Start by throwing out the popular image, because the popular image is wrong. Neanderthals were not towering. On average, they were slightly shorter than modern Europeans. What set them apart wasn't height, it was density. Their long bones carried significantly thicker cortical bone, the dense outer layer that determines how much force a skeleton can take. Their ribcage was barrel-shaped, their pelvis wider, their forearms built with the kind of leverage you'd expect from someone who wrestled large animals for a living, because in a real sense, they did. And this wasn't just a body built by hard living. Some of it was written in the genes. In 2024, researchers analyzing a gene called LRP5, one already known in medicine for causing unusually high bone density, found that Neanderthals and Denisovans carried versions our lineage lost. They tested those archaic mutations in the lab, and the mutations did exactly what the skeleton suggested. They pushed bone density up. So the difference isn't that they worked harder than you. Your skeleton is the lightweight model. Theirs was the reinforced one. Who exactly was the strange-looking one here? Now add the head, a pronounced continuous brow ridge running straight across above the eyes, a face that pushed forward through the middle instead of sitting flat, a jaw with almost no chin. Put all of that together and you get a silhouette that reads, at a glance and at a distance, as something powerful and something other, assembled entirely out of human parts. So picture it properly. You are not standing in a museum looking at a reconstruction behind glass. You are a small band of people at dusk, and one of these individuals is moving through the trees ahead of you, half obscured by branches. You don't get a calm anatomical assessment. You get a flash of heavy brow, a wide frame, an unfamiliar way of moving, and your body does exactly what it evolved to do. It files the ambiguous shape under dangerous first and sorts out the details later, if you survive long enough to sort out anything at all. That reaction is not a flaw. It's an evolved shortcut. The humans who paused to carefully verify whether an unclear shape was a threat did not always get a second chance to apply the lesson. The humans who overreacted to anything ambiguous, who ran first and asked questions never, are the ones who lived long enough to have children. Over enough generations, that bias toward treating the unclear as dangerous got wired into how you process unfamiliar shapes, especially shapes that are almost, but not quite like you. There's a name for that specific discomfort. In 1970, the Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori published a short essay in the journal Energy describing what we now call the uncanny valley. His observation was that as something artificial gets more and more human-like, your affection for it climbs, and then, right before it becomes indistinguishable from a person, it falls off a cliff into revulsion. Not quite right is far more disturbing than obviously wrong. It's why a cartoon face is charming, a mannequin is unsettling, and a wax figure of someone you know can genuinely make your skin crawl. Mori was writing about robots, but your brain didn't build that response for robots. It built it a very long time ago for faces. And here's the part that should complicate the story rather than confirm it. The creature triggering that response was not a brute. Neanderthals buried their dead. They controlled fire, made glue from birch bark, and cared for the badly injured for years at a time. The clearest example is a skeleton from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, known as Shanidar 1. This individual had a withered, likely amputated right arm, damage to the left eye socket that probably left him blind on that side, bone growths consistent with deafness, and an old crushing injury to the skull. Any one of those should have been fatal in the Pleistocene. He lived for years afterward, into what counted then as old age, which means that for years, other people fed him and protected him. Does that sound like a monster to you? The very species we may have turned into the villain of the story was taking care of its disabled, and there's a strange detail in their injuries. In 1995, the paleoanthropologists Thomas Berger and Berger Trinkaus published an analysis showing Neanderthal trauma was disproportionately concentrated in the head and neck, a pattern they noted looked statistically similar to the injuries of modern rodeo riders. Other researchers have pushed back on that comparison, and the debate is still live. But the picture it paints is hard to shake. Not monsters lurking in the dark, but hunters getting hurt at close range by very large animals over and over, and surviving it. So the fear was real, and the encounters were real. But there's still a hole in the middle of this story. Fear fades. The memory of one frightening sighting doesn't survive 40,000 years on its own. And it certainly doesn't travel across continents. So how does a fleeting encounter in a forest become an ogre that shows up in folklore on the opposite side of the planet? The answer isn't in the encounter at all. It's in what people kept finding afterward. Long after Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population, absorbed into our lineage as much as wiped out, their remains stayed in the ground. Bones don't decompose on a human timescale. Skulls, thigh bones, and jaw fragments kept surfacing for tens of thousands of years afterward, in caves, in riverbanks, in freshly dug foundations, found by people who had no framework for what a Neanderthal even was. They weren't examining a specimen, they were staring at evidence of something. And this is where the mechanism stops being a guess and becomes documented history. Because how often do you think this happened? The classicist and historian of science Adrienne Mayor spent years tracing exactly this and laid it out in her book, The First Fossil Hunters. Long before paleontology existed as a discipline, Communities across the ancient world were regularly digging up oversized, strange bones and explaining them with the only framework available, which was myth. Mayor connected Greek stories of one-eyed giants to the skulls of extinct elephants and mastodons, which have an enormous central nasal cavity that looks unmistakably like a single huge eye socket once the tusks fall away and the rest is worn down. She traced the griffin, that beaked, four-legged creature guarding gold in the mountains, to the fossil beds of the Gobi Desert, where the skeletons of a beaked dinosaur called Protoceratops erode straight out of the ground. And this kept happening well into recorded history. A mammoth bone unearthed during church construction in Vienna was kept as a relic of a giant killed in the Great Flood. 15th century Verona displayed an enormous rib as the bone of a dragon slain by the city's patron saint. Elsewhere, an elephant femur was paraded through the streets as the arm of a saint. The giant bones of Lucerne were only correctly identified as elephant in the 18th century by the anatomist Blumenbach, and none of these people were being foolish. The idea that entire species could go extinct barely existed as a concept until Georges Cuvier established it around 1800. Before that, a giant bone in the ground had to belong to something, and if it wasn't any animal you knew, it belonged to a giant. So where do Neanderthal remains fit? Straight into that same pattern. A skull with a heavy jutting brow, pulled out of a riverbank by someone with no concept of an extinct human species, does not read as an ancient person. It reads as proof that something bigger, stronger, and less human than you used to walk this land. What else could it possibly have meant to them? If you doubt how powerful that instinct is, look at what happened when science finally got its hands on one. In August 1856, quarry workers clearing a cave in Germany's Neander Valley dug up 16 bones and fragments about 2 feet down. The cave's owner assumed they came from a cave bear, and the workers nearly threw them out with the rubble. They ended up with a local schoolteacher and fossil collector named Johann Karl Fuhlrott, who recognized immediately that they were human, but not our kind of human. He took them to Hermann Schaffhausen, an anatomist at the University of Bonn, and the two announced the find in 1857. 8 years later, the Irish geologist William King formally proposed the name Homo neanderthalensis. In a footnote, read that sequence again. Even with anatomists, even with universities, even in the middle of the scientific revolution, the first instinct on encountering those bones was to say, "That isn't one of us." Now imagine having that same instinct with no science at all. You wouldn't get a species name, you'd get a story. So the ogre isn't one thing, it's two real experiences stacked on top of each other across tens of thousands of years. The first layer is living memory, the genuine evolved dread of meeting something almost human in low light, sharpened by a nervous system that treats ambiguity as danger. The second layer is physical evidence, bones robust enough to look inhuman, dug up again and again by people with no way to explain them except through story. You don't need every culture on Earth to have compared notes for the ogre to appear everywhere. You just need every culture on Earth to have inherited the same two things: a nervous system shaped by the same evolutionary pressures and a landscape that occasionally hands you the skeleton of something that isn't quite you. And that instinct never switched off. It's the reason a figure at the far end of a dark parking lot registers as a threat before your eyes have resolved a single detail. It's the reason a face that's slightly wrong bothers you more than a face that's obviously fake. You are running 40,000-year-old threat detection software on a world that mostly doesn't require it anymore. When was the last time that instinct was actually right? So the next time a story puts a hulking, half-human figure at the edge of the firelight, it's worth remembering that the image might not have come from nowhere. It might be one of the oldest true stories your species has ever told, worn down by 10,000 retellings until only the shape survived. And you are carrying a piece of the creature in your blood while you tell it.